Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Brown Girl Green. I'm Christy Drutman, and I interview environmental leaders and advocates about workplace and member diversity and inclusion. I'm working to change the image of what it means to be an environmentalist in the 21st century. I am joined by Deeohn Ferris. Deeohn is the Vice President for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the National Audubon Society. For those of you who may not know what the National Audubon Society is, they are focused a lot around conservation, birding, natural resources, and all kinds of good stuff that you'll learn about during this episode. Deeohn is an environmental justice pioneer. Her knowledge and policy expertise were instrumental to establishing the field of environmental and economic justice. Coordinating with, she helped to convene the first ever hearings and led the groundbreaking national campaign that resulted in the federal call to action, Environmental Justice Presidential Executive Order 12898, which I've learned about in my history book, so I'm fangirling right now. Deeohn has an extraordinary experience leading expert teams working on community regeneration in the U.S. and countries on 5 continents. She's a popular speaker, recipient of many professional achievement awards, and her public service includes numerous boards and committees. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Christy. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, and so I just wanted to start off today's interview by just starting with this clever little image I found on Google search, which says, "Why birding is better than American politics." On a bird, the right wing and the left wing work together center. And if you're watching this on the Crowdcast platform, you can look at this. But if you are listening to the audio podcast, just know that birding is the new way to think about a new America in the future. So I just wanted to introduce Deeohn as this superstar in the environmental justice field who has really dedicated her career and her life towards advancing equity in the environmental field. And I think that I really wanted to bring you onto my show because I think that your work, especially as a woman of color in the conservation field, is very significant, because I think a lot of people believe that, we can't care about like environmental issues until we're really addressing social justice issues in the world. And, especially with everything that's going on through American politics today, it seems like caring about the environment and caring about birds and plants and trees and so forth is kind of an afterthought. But it seems apparent that we as people of color and communities across the nation need natural resources more than ever, need to reconnect to the natural world in these dire times. So I would love to learn just a little bit more about your background growing up and getting into conservation and what really motivates you to do your work in this field.
Well, thank you, Christy. And again, thank you for the invitation to join you today. I'm excited to be here. As you know, I'm an environmental lawyer by trade, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I talk more about my background. I think very early on, as a young girl, my parents were really into parks and open spaces and nature. We had a cottage by the lake. So interacting with nature, enjoying trees, plants, wildlife, habitat was just a natural occurrence in my life. So I grew up respecting nature, enjoying nature, and appreciating opportunities on almost a daily basis to be in the outdoors. So my life is rooted in an understanding and an appreciation of nature. It's probably why I went into the environmental field. It's probably why I decided to pursue environmental law as a career, because I appreciated that preserving the planet is something that we all ought to be doing. And I wanted to contribute in my way to doing that. So I'm an environmental lawyer. In uptaking that as a career, my first real job after law school was at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And there is no other better place nationally to really understand how environment is protected through environmental laws and regulations and being participatory in protection of the planet in those ways. As I said, my first job was at EPA. It's where I learned about the mechanics of moving a national public policy agenda. It's where I learned how you work with federal and state governmental agencies and how you work with private sector companies in an interdisciplinary way, in a collaborative way to protect the environment. As we all know, EPA is the nation's chief agency for environmental policy. And it's a great place to learn the basics of federal and state legislation and regulations, congressional and internal affairs, development of regulations and compliance with environmental laws and regulations, all the ingredients that go into people working together at the intersection of the natural environment and the human environment. I was an enforcement official at EPA for a few years, filing cases against companies for failure to comply with environmental laws and regulations. And that's where I first learned that communities of color and low-income communities were disproportionately affected by environmental hazards and poisons that endangered their health and community well-being. EPA is also where I learned the lesson that communities are not at the environmental decision table in a lot of cases. And they're not engaged and involved by EPA and other public and private sector stakeholders in either public policy decisions or environmental cleanup decisions or decisions that really at a fundamental level affect community prosperity and community health. Also, I think it's important to note that as we know now, more often than not, communities are the stakeholders that have the most at stake in environmental and conservation decisions. Decisions that affect places important to them for a variety of reasons. Often, communities are the most hard-pressed to be prepared with the right knowledge and expertise to engage on complex issues when they're first confronted by them. For example, in comparing communities with environmental groups, typically, environmental groups have salaried and specialized staff, lots of experts around the table, and compared to many, many communities, lots more resources. I'll tell you something else about my journey as a woman of color in conservation, and that is that people in many of the communities that are most deleteriously affected look a lot like me. So it's also somewhat of a calling to be involved in the field of environment and conservation for me. I decided early on that working with communities was where I wanted to be, using my skills and my talents to, let's call it, level the playing field for communities. Because at heart, I am a community builder, and I think it's something that we all need to focus on, building communities in healthy ways. And for me, that means first focusing on environmental and economic justice for people most affected by policy decisions and investments or the lack of investments. So I guess bottom lining it, I wanted to prioritize working with grassroots communities to build their capacity to work with other stakeholders, providing tools and strategies to engage people and their allies in what I like to call institutional and organizational change, building the capacity of other stakeholders to work with communities and building the capacity of communities to be at the table, speaking the language, understanding the processes, and being effective at advancing organizational and institutional change. So that's a little bit about how I got into being very, very interested and committed to the inclusion and activation of people of color in their communities around environment and conservation. I think Republicans, Democrats, Independents, we all live in places, and we all understand that in order for us to thrive and prosper, those places need to be clean and healthy. And I think that's the conversation we need to have. Although, unfortunately, I think there's a lot of partisanization of language these days that impedes us talking to each other and hearing each other. And hopefully, as time moves on, we'll see improvement in the balkanization of politics that we're seeing now.
Yeah, like I'm just wondering with like this current administration, the political atmosphere we're in right now, like with Executive Order 12898, like what are some of your feelings about what environmental justice means in the America we have today?
Well, I think it's important for us to understand that the human environment and the natural environment are interconnected. They're inextricable from each other. And we can't talk about protecting birds and wildlife without talking about preserving the spaces that birds and wildlife migrate through. So we have to work hard to communicate the interconnectedness of the natural and the human environment. And as we recognize that interconnectedness, then addressing social issues becomes less of a barrier. Social issues are human issues, are environmental issues. And we've just got to get that through some seemingly today very resistant heads.
I completely agree. I feel that there's a lot of resistance where people feel this their own sense of internalized oppression, that they feel that those are things that they can't care about, or those are things that they don't have access to, or those are things that like they are unable to like see in the future or their future, that they can have access to like a healthy, clean environment, and that's something they deserve. And I think that that's why there's such a disconnect for people who are like, oh, those two things are separate, like social justice issues and environmental issues. And it's like, but they're all one and the same. And until people realize that, then like there are going to continue to be these like inequities and these hierarchies on how things are misdistributed and just misaligned across the country. So I totally agree with that.
Absolutely.
And yeah. And yeah, building off of that, I just want to know, like, with your work in Audubon, what do you think is one of the biggest challenges that you all face in pushing that kind of conversation forward, saying that, like, you know, we're committed to conservation, we're committed to protecting place, but we also recognize that in the political climate that we're in right now, like, we need to address who we're reaching and who we're talking to and who we're including in the conversation. So I just wanted to know what have been some challenges that you all have faced in dealing with that.
That's a great question, Christy. And there are all kinds of challenges. And I want to start out by saying that one of the biggest challenges for us at Audubon, if not the biggest challenge at Audubon, is also the biggest challenge for government, the biggest challenge for the private sector, academia. It's a big challenge for everyone, and that is culture change. So what we're talking about now is equity, racial and cultural diversity, and inclusion. And for organizations like Audubon and many, many others, if not all others, it's culture change. So what does that mean? What it means is that Audubon and other organizations and institutions operate within the dominant culture. You could call it the white culture. You could also refer to it as white privilege. So all of those aspects, the dominant culture is largely exclusionary of races and cultures that are perceived as different. So hence culture change. We've got to deal with culture change. So at Audubon, that means transforming a venerable and influential 113-year-old, very white organization. We've got 1.2 million members. Our organization crosses 5 time zones. We're in the US, the Caribbean, and South America. We have nearly 800 employees at 60 locations, 463 chapters. It's a big organization, and culture change is no small feat. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we work on multiple levels in multiple ways. And the biggest thing is that we need to concentrate organizationally to provide impetus around culture change in a few ways. We need to build the skills of people at Audubon. And in building those skills, we've got to help people understand the barriers and the biases, the structural or baked in governmental laws and policies and private sector decisions that impede the success of people of color and other population groups, such as LGBTQ and physically challenged populations and young people, for example. So we need to be dedicated to building skills around understanding implicit bias or attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding and our actions and decisions. And we need to be culturally competent, which means being respectful and responsible to the beliefs and practices and cultures and linguistic needs of racially and culturally diverse population groups. We need to know how to engage in difficult conversations about race and economic status and different cultures. So grappling with and overcoming barriers, creating culture change at Audubon and other places is really going to be transformative. It's hard work. It requires budget and staff and resources. And I think the most important thing to understand about it is that culture change for organizations like Audubon is existential. Racial and ethnic and demographic changes across America are happening now, and change demands it. By 2043 or 2045, depending who's counting and how you're counting, people of color in the United States are going to be over half the population. We already have states that are California, New Mexico, Hawaii. Cities, big cities, Atlanta, Miami, New York, many others are there already. These are changes that are inevitable and irreversible. And you might be asking, Christy, why am I leading with race? And it's because race is one of the most powerful determinants of equity. Focusing on race provides an opportunity to introduce a framework and tools and resources that can be applied to open doors to other groups, young people, LGBTQ, physically challenged, to kind of stick with those for a moment. The demographic shifts that are existential for these organizations are also generational. This year, in 2018, millennials are the largest single eligible voter cohort. That's a pretty significant fact. And guess what else? 44% of those millennials are young people of color. This is the most diverse adult generation in American history. Go millennials. So organizations in the future, to succeed, they're going to look more like America. They're going to operate in ways that are more welcoming, that take advantage of and incorporate the perspectives and strategies that are important to people of all races and cultures. From the environmental and conservation standpoint, we talk a lot about biodiversity, making nature stronger and more resilient. So, to racial and cultural diversity, reflecting the makeup of the communities that we serve will make us better and stronger and improve us in every way. Achieving equity, diversity, and inclusion. We'll do this for environment and conservation organizations, for government, academia, institutions in the public and private sectors. So that's a little bit of background about the challenges, and it's not just for Audubon. These are challenges that are affecting organizations everywhere.
Absolutely. And I think that this generation wants to see organizations that represent their values and represent the people that they relate to the most. So I'm really glad you spoke about that. And I just want to know on a more practical level on where people can get tapped into Audubon and the things that you all are doing. For people who don't even know anything about outdoor recreation or birding, like some people don't even know what birding is, but birding's like bird watching and just like having a passion and love for birds, which I recently got into starting in January, and I call myself a bird. I'm like so into it. But I just wanted to know, like, what do you feel are ways in which not just young people, but people of color, low-income communities, people that may view themselves as identifying with a marginalized community, like, why do you think outdoor recreation and getting in touch with nature is so, like, important to their resilience?
Well, the first thing I want to say about that is that bird-friendly communities are healthy communities. And the second thing I'd like to say is that birding is not only about telescopes and binoculars. Birding is about helping people understand that birds are an important part of nature and that birds can be a way that everyone appreciates nature. So if we have bird-friendly communities, we have healthy communities. Birds are a bellwether of health in wild places, health in rural areas, health in urban spaces. So birding is a relaxing activity, and it takes you outdoors, which many studies are telling us is important for health and mental restoration. So a little bit about that. There's a growing body of studies that shows that nature heals and soothes, new word, and restores us. Research tells us that nature can increase or reduce stress, which clearly affects us negatively. What we're seeing and hearing and experiencing at any moment is changing not only our mood, but how our nervous system and our endocrine systems and immune systems may be working. Early documentation is telling us that being out in nature and experiencing nature may even reduce mortality, but definitely it improves our health. So basically, regardless of age or culture, humans find nature pleasing, and we need to be out in it. We're genetically programmed to find trees and plants and water and other nature elements engrossing, fascinating. We're absorbed by nature scenes, and nature scenes distract from pain and discomfort. Because we find nature inherently interesting, we can focus on what we're experiencing when we're there. It provides respite for what in these days of technology are overactive minds, refreshing us, helping us apply ourselves to new tasks. Some new interesting research actually shows that in children that ADHD, children that have ADHD, that being out in nature increases their attention span, which is only a good thing. So the other aspect that I haven't mentioned already is physical activity. Obviously, we have an obesity crisis in this country. So being out in nature gives us an opportunity to exercise, in addition to being beneficial for our mental and emotional well-being. On bird watching, well, one thing I've discovered as a budding bird watcher is that you got to have some quick reflexes to watch some birds. They move around. And you also have to have patience to observe them. And you have to have the skill of being quiet in a space that helps quieten our minds. So there are all kinds of advantages to outdoor recreation, mental resilience, emotional well-being, and physical improvement. And those are all clearly good reasons why bird watching might be an avocation for some of us. Maybe not all of us, but certainly it's beneficial for some of us.
And what would you say to people who might not feel like they have access to birding or like access to outdoor recreation, like, but they do want to get started, but just don't know like where to get started? Like, what are some basic things that they could start doing in their neighborhoods or communities to start getting in touch with that if they like can't just go on like a camping trip for a weekend or can't go on a birding excursion for a few hours?
Well, I can tell you that some of the best birding I've ever done has been in my backyard. And so there isn't any need to take long treks to wild, expansive spaces to appreciate birds. And I think we need to understand that birding is not only about telescopes and binoculars and khakis and hats. Birding can be done in your everyday clothing on an everyday basis, looking out the windows, or being in your backyard or in your front yard or in your neighborhood park. This is not an inaccessible activity. On the other hand, getting out into wild spaces, as we've just talked about, is highly beneficial. And if there are ways to connect with organizations in your communities that are getting people outdoors, and there's an increasing number of organizations led by young men and young women of color who are specifically focusing on African American experiences and Latino experiences and Asian and Native American experiences, and bringing people together in races and cultures and taking them to wilder places to experience the outdoors. So I encourage folks to do a little Googling because there's an organization where you are. They are in every place, whether they're led by people of color or led by white people, doesn't really make a difference. Connect with these organizations and take advantage of the opportunities that are being provided to experience nature in bigger and wilder places. We'll be better for it. And the other thing to add about that is contributing our cultures to the conversations is important. Helping people understand that people appreciate nature in different ways, that we have something to contribute to this conversation and this movement, and what we have to say and what we think is important to protecting the planet.
I love that. What would you say to a young woman of color like me, but maybe even younger than me since I graduated college, who is interested in getting in the environmental field and conservation, but doesn't really know if like they could be a part of this field because they don't see many people that look like them? What would you say to her?
I would say just do it. In life every day, we have to confront and surmount challenges. And one of the most significant challenges of people of color is isolation and being the only. And I've certainly been that over and over and over again. But I didn't let it stop me from doing what I was interested in doing. And I would encourage people to pursue what it is they want to do, irrespective of who is around them. And also to look for like-minded folks who are interested in doing the same thing and partner up and buddy up and share the experience if there's an apprehension about being alone in the context. But even in the face of the buddying up and the finding friends, as young people of color, as people of color generally, we have to recognize that there will be many places where we will be the only, and we can't be intimidated by that. And as much as we may be experiencing negative conduct, we have to, and we always have, and we will continue to power through that to make sure that we are prepared and ready and able to prosper in doing the things that we want to do.
I really needed to hear that. If there was one bird that you think you embody in your own life and how you exist through the world, what would it be and why?
Oh my, I haven't thought about that very much. And there are so many birds, and I had to mention I am a budding birder. I'm starting to get into it here. So I don't know that I have actually found the bird that I embody, but I can share this with you. I have been a backyard birder for a very long time. And there is one very unobtrusive little bird that until very recently, I was never able to see, but I was struck by its song. And this bird has the most beautiful song, and it's a hidey bird. It hides, so it's hard to find, and it's small and it's brown, so it isn't flashy with bright plumage, but the song, Christy, will stop you in its tracks. So I don't know that I necessarily embody this bird, but it's the Carolina wren. And you can go on Audubon's website and search for this bird and click and hear its song. And that fascinates me. I love to hear the song. I know what season I'm going to hear the song, and I listen for it for the entire season. Wakes me up in the morning while I'm tending my tomatoes and my peppers and my herbs in my backyard. I listen for that song. It's a harbinger of spring for me. And she sings right up until the hottest weather. And then I know that I have to settle back in and wait in expectation for the next spring. And I yearn for it every spring because I know then spring is sprung and good weather's coming because the Carolina wren is back in my backyard.
That was a beautiful story. I love that. And I just want to thank you again. This was just such an incredible conversation, just learning about your story and the work that you're doing, the very important work that you're doing to advance women of color in particular in the environmental field. It is really inspiring to me, and I think it's something that I've been searching for a while for the past few months. As I started this show, I've been really looking for folks like you who I know live this and breathe this career and this passion in your everyday life. And I can just see it and hear it in your voice. And I think that it's something that brings me joy and hope in my career and my future. And I just want to show everyone that I wore this bird pin just for today's interview, just because I was so excited for it. And just thank you for joining this conversation. And I hope that we're able to share more resources from Audubon so more folks can learn about the great work that you're all doing. So just to finish it off, are there any other resources or items that you would like to recommend to our listeners today that you think could plug them in?
Well, I would like to plug you into www.audubon.org, where there are all kinds of resources to explore, to understand much more about why it's important that we ought to be protecting the planet by protecting the birds and wildlife habitat. So please log in, click click us on and go through. There are all kinds of rich resources for learning. And also, Christy, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to join you today and remind everyone what an example you are for young people and all people. We're not breaking new ground in helping people of color experience the environment and nature. We are contributing to ongoing work. We're soldiers. And I want to thank you for your role in helping move all this forward. And thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about why I think it's so important that we are all actively involved in this work.
Thank you so much, Deeohn. And thank you everyone who's listening and will listen once you receive the replay after this episode concludes. You can check out more of my episodes on my Crowdcast profile, crowdcast.io/browngirlgreen. You can also check out my Instagram and social media on Twitter at browngirl_green. And I will be keeping you all updated on future episodes. So thank you again. This is Brown Girl Green. My name's Christy Drutman, and I interview environmental leaders and advocates about workplace and member diversity and inclusion. I'm working to change the image of what it means to be an environmentalist in the 21st century. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.